Hi everyone, Mike again with MEG Motors. Today we're going to be looking at this McCullough 3200 chainsaw. It's a 2-cycle 32cc chainsaw with a 14-inch bar. We don't really know anything about it other than the fact that it doesn't run. Like all engines, we need three things to make this one run. We need compression. I pulled this one through. It feels like it has enough compression. We need spark and we need fuel. And so the first test I like to do when I start working on an engine like this or any device like this, I'm going to pull the air filter. We're going to shoot a little carburetor cleaner in the carburetor, and we're going to see if we can get it to pop off. And if it pops off, we know that we have spark and spark at the right time, and we know that we'll have compression, and that's typically the case. So we're going to pop top off right quick, and we're going to run a test and see what we need to look at on this one. So we can kind of see looking in here that the air filter, what used to be an air filter in there, has disintegrated, and so there's just bits of foam flying around. I also noticed that the primer is missing. There should be a primer here, and I don't see any fuel lines on it anywhere. So we definitely have some work to do on the fuel system on this one, but we're gonna go ahead and shoot a little carburetor cleaner in there and confirm at least that we have ignition and compression, and if we do, we'll start working on the fuel system. All right, so with the choke wide open and the throttle wide open, I'm going to shoot a little shot in there. Doesn't take much. And then we're going to lock the throttle open. Switch is on, and we're going to pull it through a few times and see what happens. Uh-oh. Well, that wasn't good. Somebody had left the starter loose, and so it came loose when I pulled it. Let's tighten that back up right quick. Hope we didn't hurt anything. All right, I'm going to do a fresh shot in there, and let's see what happens. All right, good. So you heard that. We got a little bit of a start out of it. That's a good sign. That confirms we have spark, and we have spark at the right time, and we have enough compression to make this one run. So we're going to do a look over and see what we need to do to make this one run. So like I said, I looked down here and you can already see we don't have any fuel lines on it. And I looked down inside the tank. I don't see any fuel lines in the tank. There should be two lines in there, a fuel pickup line and a return line. There's no fuel line there. We're going to look in the oil tank. There's also be an oil line in the oil tank. And I see nothing in there. So we're missing the oil line just like on the other McCullough we worked on. So we're going to have to pull this cover off and put on an oil line as well. So we already know we need a primer, need fuel lines, and I'm sure we're going to need carburetor work as well. So let's get started on this one. All right, so we already know that we're missing the fuel lines on this one, and I'm assuming we're going to have to do carburetor work. So we're going to go ahead and pull the carburetor off of this one. I've also looked inside the oil tank. This is the oil tank. So chainsaws typically have an automatic chain oiling system that'll oil the chain, and that system needs to work, or the chain tends to overheat and it'll stretch and get really loose and can fly off. And so we definitely have to get the chain oiling system working. And I already know on this chainsaw that to replace the line for the oil pump, we have to take this side of the case off. So we're going to go ahead and pull the carburetor off, and we're going to pull the side of the case off. It's going to make it easier to put the fuel lines on, and we'll get started getting some lines put on this, and then we'll work on the carburetor as well and see if we can make sure that the carburetor is okay, that it doesn't need any work. The carburetor on these comes off pretty easy, especially when the fuel lines are missing. That's pretty much it. Throttle linkage is right here, comes off pretty easy. And there's our carburetor. And then we have a couple of screws on this side. So we can just unplug the wires from our kill switch. And set that off to the side. All right, so we need an oil line. You look at the tank right here. There's an opening in the tank right here. Looks like there may be a piece of line still stuck in there. So a line goes from here to this fitting here for the chain oiling system. And then we need 2 fuel lines into the tank. They go through these openings right here. So I'm gonna go get some fuel lines and we'll see if we can get some put in here. Okay, so we're gonna work on putting a new line in the fuel tank. While we were off camera, I washed out the fuel tank a little bit. It had some old pieces of fuel line down in the bottom, and it had this piece in it, which is the pickup that goes on the line. This is a weighted pickup. Helps the line stay in the oil while you're moving the chainsaw around. And so to install the line, we're going to use this tool here. This is a special tool just for pulling fuel lines in. It's got a hook on one end, as you can see. And so what we'll do is we'll feed it in through the hole, we'll connect the fuel line to it, and then we'll pull it back and pull the fuel line into the tank. So I'm going to feed it into the hole, back up out the top. Now the fuel line we've already cut at an angle. Hopefully you can see that angle. And then we're going to use a poke and we're going to poke a hole in the fuel line to help get it on the pull tool. And we're just going to put a hole through it just like that. And then we're going to put it on the line to go through the line. There we go. And then I've got some lube. This is actually bead lube. It's used for mounting tires, but it works good for lubing up fuel lines when you're pulling them in. And so yeah, so now we're just gonna feed all of this back through, try to get it to come back out that hole. There we go, came right through. Alright, so we're gonna cut the end off square. Gonna hook it up to our fuel pump or our oil pump. Actually, we're gonna wait on that a sec because we may have to pull some out. Now we're gonna measure off a little bit of fuel line, what we think it's gonna take inside the tank there. And we're gonna cut this line off. Then we're gonna put our pickup on the line. We're going to push that down into the tank. And then we're going to pull some of this line out until we have what we believe is the right length of line in there to keep the pickup down in the oil. That looks good. And then we'll cut the line off over here to the right length and put it on the oil pump. Yeah, so hopefully you can see that. That gets us a new fuel line on our oil pump, so we can oil the chain. All right, so now we're going to work on putting some fuel lines on this chainsaw. If you look down here, you can hopefully see there's 2 holes coming out of the fuel tank. One of those will be for a fuel pickup line. It'll have a weighted fuel filter on it, just like the oil tank had. And the other one will be a return line that comes off of the primer, and so it'll terminate just inside the tank. And so we need to pull 2 lines in there and cut them off the length, and then we'll be ready to work on the carburetor. All right, so just like we did with the oil tank, I have my tool in through the opening and out the gas cap and connected to the fuel line. We're going to lube the fuel line up a little bit. We're going to see if we can pull this line in. It doesn't matter on this one which fuel line goes in which hole, as long as they both go in. Alright, so there's our first fuel line. We're going to say that this is going to be the vent line, which goes to the primer right about here. So I'm just going to cut this one off about right there. And then we'll get the exact length when we get the carburetor back on. Alright, so now we need to do another one. I'm going to cut a diagonal. Going to poke a hole in the line. We're going to feed our tool into the tank. There's our fuel line on the tool. Move it up a little bit. Let's see if we can pull this one in. There we go. All right, so on this one, we're going to leave a little extra line because I'm not sure exactly how that's going to need to run once we get it in place. And we need to leave enough fuel line on this one to get to the bottom of the tank for the fuel. Now on this one, the original fuel pickup was missing. I found the original pickup in the oil tank, but it was missing in the fuel tank. So I have a few spares. So I pulled this one out of my spares. I'm going to put this on this line. Stuff that back down in the tank just like we did on the oil tank. So if you're wondering where to get fuel lines, the fuel lines actually come in 4 different sizes, 4 popular sizes anyway, and you can search on Amazon or eBay for like trimmer fuel line, and there's a lot of places that will sell you an assortment of all 4 fuel lines, all 4 sizes, about 2 feet of each one, which is enough to do 1 piece, whatever you're working on, 1 chainsaw, 1 trimmer, whatever you're working on. And so yeah, it's relatively cheap, probably $10 or so. You can get 2 feet of all 4 sizes, and it'll have the size that you need in almost all cases. All right, so that's our fuel lines in. Our oil line is in. We can put the side of this case back on, and then we'll start working on the carburetor. We're going to work on this carburetor next. This carburetor is a Walbro. Hopefully you can read that. I know sometimes that doesn't come out good on the screen, but this is a Walbro. There are typically 2 kinds, either Walbro or Zama, and this one's a Walbro. It's a WT 347. That's going to come in. We're going to need that information later, but if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a pretty big fan of these carburetors. They're really cool little devices. Actually, it's a fuel pump on one side and a carburetor on the other side with a metering chamber. So it both pumps the fuel out of the tank and meters it on this side and provides it to the engine to run. And it does it all with very few moving parts. There's a few things that we need to look at in here to make sure that this one is going to work okay. But they're relatively simple to work on, and they work good. So we have to have a diaphragm carburetor because a regular float bowl carburetor wouldn't work as we turn the devices upside down and sideways like we do on a chainsaw. So we're going to take this side apart first. This is the fuel pump side. And so let's see, we get that off. Yeah, that looks relatively clean. This is actually a fuel pump membrane and a gasket together. It looks like one piece, they get stuck together, but there's actually two pieces. And so this is the fuel pump side, and the important thing on this side is that this diaphragm here, this is the fuel pump diaphragm, that it's soft and flexible, and these two little tabs right here also need to be soft and flexible. And I can tell you that these are pretty rigid, so this carburetor probably wouldn't work with this membrane. I'm going to look and see if I have one, and if not, we may have to order a kit for this carburetor. This looks like a pretty common one though, so I'm hoping I'll have one. So this is the fuel pump side of things, and the way these work is that on a 2-cycle engine, the crankcase is sealed, and we have the crankcase alternately has pressure when the piston's coming down, and it has vacuum when the piston's going up. It's almost like a cylinder on the bottom of the piston. And so that alternating suction and vacuum is presented to the carburetor through the intake manifold. There'll be a special passage in the intake manifold, and it'll come through that hole right there, as you can see that right there, and it'll go through this cover, which will be on here. It'll go through this hole, which comes out right here, and so that alternating pressure and vacuum will be present in this chamber right here. And when this gasket is in place, it'll make this diaphragm move up and down. So that diaphragm is also on this side of the carburetor, moving up and down. And so as it moves up and down, it creates the same alternating pressure and vacuum on this side of the diaphragm. And so the two one-way valves, so when we were creating negative pressure in this chamber, that negative pressure will be present here on this port, and it will cause this valve to lift, and fuel will flow from the fuel tank through this fitting up through this one-way valve down through this hole onto the back side of this membrane. At the same time, when we present negative pressure there, it's going to seal this one, which is going to stop us from pulling the fuel back out of the carburetor. Now when we have the alternate stroke and we have pressure, and this the diaphragm is pushed down into this chamber to create pressure, it'll lift this valve, which will push fuel here and push the fuel into this chamber, into this orifice right here, which will be connected right here to this screen. And this screen right here is a filter, and a little bit of trash in there, is a filter that goes to the metering side of the carburetor. So we get the fuel pump working over here. All of its work is to put fuel right here so that we can use it on this side. So we're going to open this side up and take a look in here and see how things look in here. All right, so this is our metering chamber side. Again, we have a membrane and a gasket over here. I'll pull those off. And so the important thing on this side is that this membrane also be very soft and flexible. This one is not too bad, actually. I've seen a lot worse, but this needs to be very soft and flexible. And we're probably going to put a new one in here anyway because we're in here. This one's a little bit stiff, but not too bad. And so what happens when we have fuel present here on the fuel pump side, over here on the metering chamber side, the engine will pull fuel out of this chamber through this orifice right here and use it to make the engine run. And as it uses fuel out of this chamber, it will pull this diaphragm. We'll pull this diaphragm down into the chamber until it hits this lever, which will raise this needle off of the seat. And when that needle is raised off the seat, fuel under pressure from the fuel pump will flow into the metering chamber. Now as the metering chamber fills with fuel, it will lift this diaphragm back up away from the metering lever, and the lever will rise up and the needle will seat. And so what can happen if these metering diaphragms get rigid, if they get rigid, if they get stuck down, then fuel will be flowing under pressure into this chamber all the time, and it will flood the engine. And if they get stuck up and they're so hard that the engine can't pull them back down, then this chamber will starve for fuel and the engine won't run. So that needs to be, this is probably the most critical part of this engine. This is what I normally see go bad. These will get really, really stiff. Something in the gas today makes these go really, really stiff. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna take this metering lever out, and we're gonna make sure that that needle is clean. You wanna hold the lever in place when you do this because it is under spring pressure. There's a small spring in there, and if that goes flying, you'll probably never find it. All right, and so looking at this needle, hopefully you can see that needle. It should be orange on the tip. This one should be orange on the tip, and it's all silver. You can see a little orange ring around it. That's where it's been seating. But it's all silver. That's tarnish and residue on there that we're going to clean off. So the way I like to clean these is to spray a little carburetor cleaner in the corner of the rag. And I'll put the needle in there and spin it. And you can see the dirt that comes off of there. I just keep doing that. You want to be a little bit careful with this because the carburetor cleaner can cause some of these rubber parts to swell. So once I get it clean, I like to dry it off. And then hopefully you can see now that that needle is a orange color on the end. That's what it should be. All right, so I'm gonna look through my parts and see if I got the parts that we need to rebuild this one, and if we do, we'll put it back together. All right, we're in good shape on this one. I had the right gasket, the right fuel pump membrane, and I have a good metering diaphragm. This one doesn't look exactly like this one, but it has all the right holes in the right places. And the other thing that's important when you're looking at metering diaphragms, you can buy these on Amazon or eBay as well. Just search for, you know, a Zama metering diaphragm or Walbro diaphragm, and there'll be several different shapes. There's about 4 or 5 different shapes of these that will come up, and they're relatively cheap. You can buy them for a couple dollars. It's important that you not only have the right shape, but this button on some of these is almost flush with the disc, and on some of it's raised like it is on this one. You have to match that as well. If you put one of these with the raised button on one that needs the flush button, then it will hold the metering arm open and it'll flood the carburetor. So you have to get that right. And so yeah, so this one's gonna work fine in this carburetor. And so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put our needle back in. And so we're gonna slide the needle right back in the hole that it came out of. And then we're gonna put the spring in its hole, just like that. Then I'll hold the metering lever like this. I'm going to set it on the spring first and then pull it back and slide it under the needle. And once we get it on, you can look, hopefully you can see the needle there. Let me see if that comes out on the camera. See, the needle there is in the right place. And so if that's in the right place, we're going to come down here and put the screw back in place that holds it all together. And then it's important on these that this arm, the end of the metering lever, be at the right height. If it's too high or too low, it will impact how it opens the needle. And so it's important. So remember when we talked earlier, I told you this was a WT carburetor. So I have this special gauge that comes from Walbro, and it has a bunch of letter designations on it. Hopefully you can see those. And so we're going to look for the one that says WT, which is right here. And so with that, that means we're going to use this piece right here to gauge the metering lever. And so we'll hold it in place. and put it right on the carburetor, just like this. And then we're going to look at the metering lever, and the metering lever should just be touching the arm. This one's just a touch low. I'm going to raise it up just a little bit. That'd probably be okay if we left it that way, but I'm going to raise it up just a little bit. All right, so let's see if you can see that now. So now with the gauge on, it's just touching the lever. That's where we want it. All right, so next we're going to put the fuel pump side together, and it's important on the fuel pump side that this diaphragm go on first. These flaps that I told you about have to seal up against the openings in this side of the carburetor, and so this piece has to go on first. And then this gasket goes on right there. And then we'll put this the cover back on. Now on this side, the metering lever, the metering diaphragm goes on first. So we're going to set that in place. You might think that the, oh no, I'm sorry, that's backwards. The gasket goes on first. It always seems to me like the metering diaphragm should go on first, but kind of like on the fuel pump side, right? They got the diaphragm on first, but on the metering side, the gasket goes on first. And then the metering diaphragm goes on. If you get that backwards, it'll flood the carburetor. All right, and then we're going to put this cover on. All right, that's it. That's our carburetor all back together and ready to go to work. There's 2 needles on this. Hopefully you can see those. Luckily these are just slotted. A lot of times there'll be weird shapes on the end of these needles, but these are just slotted. They're marked L and H. So L for low speed, H for high speed. Low speed is where we'll adjust the mixture at idle to make it idle properly, and H is high speed for wide open operation to make it run right when we're cutting wood. And this will be the idle speed. So we may have to adjust some of those once we get this back on. We're going to put this back on and see if we can make this thing run. All right, so this chainsaw has a external primer. Sometimes the primer is built into the carburetors, and sometimes it's external like this one. This one was missing when we got this chainsaw, but I have spares. And so the primer has 2 lines on it. It has a long one and a short one. And the short one is the suction side of the primer, and the long one is the exhaust side. So when we pump the primer, it'll pull fuel into the short side and exhaust it out the long side. And so when you have external primer, you actually have 3 fuel lines on the device. There's one that comes from the fuel pickup, which is this one, and that will go straight to the carburetor right here. And then you'll have one that comes out of the carburetor on this side that goes to the suction side of the primer. And then you have one from the discharge side of the primer that goes to the line back to the tank, which is this line right here. We've left it a little longer and I have it sticking out of the primer hole right now. And so, yeah, when you pump the primer, it pulls a vacuum, it pulls fuel all the way through the carburetor. So it's gonna pull fuel into the fuel pump side, fill up all the chambers in the fuel pump, and then pull it all the way through the passage over to the metering side and fill the chamber on the metering side as well. And so we need to measure all of these fuel lines and get them cut to the right length. So I'm going to temporarily put this carburetor back on and just hand tighten the screws. just so it'll stay in place. And so this fuel line goes on right here. I'm going to mark it where it needs to go. I'm going to cut this one off. And then I'm going to use what's left over of this fuel line to be the third fuel line that we need, which is also going to come from the primer. It's going to go to this fitting on the carburetor. I'm going to cut this line off. This is the line that goes back to our fuel tank. So this is the return line. And we're going to put the return line on the long fitting of the primer. Then we're going to put this new third line on the shorts fitting. And then we're going to push this primer back into the saw. The primer will have a little notch on it that fits into this notch on the case so it doesn't spin. So you have to line that up, then it'll just snap into place. All right, there we go. It's snapped in. Well, this line now needs to come around and go on to this fitting down here. I'm going to measure that off a little bit, and we're going to cut that. All right, now we're ready to permanently install this carburetor. We're going to take it off. I'm going to hook the throttle up first. And I'm going to put this fuel line on. And I'm going to put this fuel line on. All right, and then we're going to put the screws back in. Make sure our gasket's in place. All right, so with all that work done, we are actually ready to see if we can make this one run. So we're gonna put some gas in it and give it a few pulls and see if it'll start. Okay, so with the fuel lines all connected and the primer installed, I put some gas in the tank. We're going to pump the primer, and we hope that we see fuel coming out of this line going back to the tank, and the primer should fill with fuel. So here we go. Let's pump it a few times. There we go. We're seeing some fuel coming through. That's good. There's fuel in the primer bulb now. So we're ready for a test start. I've also put some chain oil, bar and chain oil in the chain oil tank. And so we're going to confirm once it starts, if it starts, that the chain is oiling as well. So I'm going to reset the camera and we'll give this a try. Okay, so with fuel in the tank and oil in the bar and oil tank, we're going to see if we can get this one to fire up. So switch on, go to full choke, set the throttle, hit the primer a couple times. See what happens. Alright, there's a little start. Go to half choke. Okay, so hopefully you could see when I was running the chainsaw, I was pointing it down at this board, and we can see on this board a spray of oil right here. So that confirms for us that the chain oiling system is working as it should. So everything's good with this chainsaw. It runs good, sounds good, starts easy, and seems to be running good. So I think that one's ready to go back to work. So I hope you liked the video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and check my playlist for other similar videos about small engine repair. And we'll see you next time.